permanent disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday, May 24th, issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump just took us somewhere the country has never been before. President Trump has been thinking a lot about his place in history. It's one of the reasons, according to recent reporting by The Atlantic and The Times, that he's paying so little attention to his plummeting popularity and so much attention to remodeling Washington in his own image. But there's no arch high enough, no ballroom gilded enough to distract from the mountain of corruption he's constructing. Last week's announcement of a $1.8 billion government slush fund, ostensibly for victims of what Mr. Trump has called the Justice Department weaponization, but almost certainly destined for his allies, guarantee it. The president may wish to be considered in the same class as Napoleon or Alexander the Great, but he's in danger of turning himself into the next Mobutu Sese Seko or Suharto, a kleptocrat, remember, not for his ideas and not for his power, but for his greed. Mr. Trump has devoted a large portion of his second term to enriching himself and his family with foreign and private funds, the crypto deals, the rapid-fire stock trades, the Boeing 747 he accepted as a gift from Qatar. But until recently, there was no evidence that the most brazen capers involved taking actively, directly from you and me. That changed when he, two of his sons, and the Trump family business sued the government for $10 billion over the leak of his tax returns. In effect, Mr. Trump, the private citizen, was suing President Trump, the head of the executive branch. He didn't bother to pretend it made sense. I'm supposed to work out a settlement with myself, he quipped to reporters. Surprise, surprise. That settlement was really sweet. The 10-figure anti-weaponization fund is a new low. Mr. Trump plunging his bruised hands into public accounts and scooping out money. Trump supporters convicted of crimes connected to the January 6th riot could get large spoonsful. But the Trump clan looks to be the biggest beneficiaries of all. As part of the settlement, the U.S. government would be barred from prosecuting or further auditing the Trumps or their family business for any potential misconduct preceding the agreement. That would save the Trump from penalties that some estimate could reach $100 million or beyond. More than that, it would functionally put the family beyond the reach of the law in these tax cases. The order is intended to last, according to Acting Attorney General Ted Blanche, forever. As the details of the arrangement were being announced, the Treasury Department's top lawyer, former clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas, quit. Just in terms of sheer dollars, this is the most corrupt action in American history, says Brendan Ballou, former Justice Department special counsel. He's representing a pair of police officers during the Capitol riot who are suing in federal court to stop the fund. That may be the most infamous thing that Donald Trump does beyond January 6, 2021. Mr. Trump is the defining political figure of the past decade, but despite his enormous influence, he's had relatively few legacy-making accomplishments. As a Times opinion columnist Ezra Klein noted, Mr. Trump has preferred, especially in this second term, not to enact sweeping policies, but to make small bore deals, especially if those bargains require the other side to bend the knee. He's bullish specific schools instead of remaking the educational system and cut bargains with a few drug retailers instead of recasting the U.S. government relationship with Big Pharma. He hasn't been able to break NATO, not yet. And thankfully, his administration is a long way from millions of deportations. So far, only Mr. Trump's Supreme Court appointment and their warped decisions have amounted to truly historical changes. But openly monetizing the presidency is a true Trump innovation. You have to go back to at least 100 years to the administration of Warren Harding or Ulysses Grant to find anything remotely similar, and no one ever accused Harding of minting name coins. This isn't the honest graft of Tammany Hall. Corruption as the price paid for public improvement, the Times' Jamil Bowie wrote. It is petty theft. Mr. Trump has already pardoned convicted criminals after receiving donations on their behalf. The electric car executive Trevor Milton gave nearly $1 million to a pro-Trump group before getting the good news. The convicted tax cheat, Paul Walzak's successful pardon application cited his mom's fundraising for Mr. Trump. Meanwhile, a cottage industry has arisen of Trump cronies who leverage their access on behalf of people seeking presidential pardons or commutations. The top entertainment executive, Tim LeWick, was pardoned after the Fox News host Trey Gowdy, an attorney for Mr. Lewin, brought up Mr. Lewick's case over a round of golf with the president. This new slush fund, set up with minimal guardrails, not even a definition of what constitutes weaponization, could take all the ethically disasters of the pardon market and simply multiply them by, well, $1.8 billion. Just think what people might be willing to do to get this money and what Mr. Trump might get in return. The fund would institutionalize the ethical disaster. Forget the one-off deals, the handshakes at the 18th hole. That would make cronyism an official function of the federal government, a U.S. agency for corruption. MAGA diehards like the election-denying My Pillow chief executive Mike Lindell and the political operative Michael Caputo are already expressing interest in cash from the kitty. Some of Mr. Trump's most dangerous supporters are likely to jump in from behind. The primary risk that this money is going to be used to fund paramilitary organizations that are loyal to the president, Mr. Bellew said. The financial support for violence is going to be the most important thing, and it's fundamentally new and different from, say, the Qatari jet. That could include 5 members of the Proud Boys, who sued the government for $100 million last year, claiming political persecution after their conviction for their role in the January 6th riot, in which 140 law enforcement officers were injured. Could also include the heads of the Oath Keepers, a group with an even longer record of violence. The self-described American terrorist Andrew Paul Johnson was convicted of his role in the Capitol riot, pardoned by Mr. Trump, and subsequently found guilty of molesting 2 children. To silence his victims, he said to have promised them a share of the millions he said he was about to get from the federal government for being a January 6er. On Tuesday, Democratic senators asked Mr. Blanche for assurances that an abusive felon like Mr. Johnson or an extremist group like the Oath would be barred from receiving payments from the $1.8 billion fund. Mr. Blanche declined, saying the decision would have to be to a 5-person commission. All 5 members would be appointed by him, Mr. Blanche said, and Mr. Trump would have the power to fire any at will. If political violence committed in the president's name is not only tolerated but actively rewarded, it could take this already blank timeline somewhere much darker. What could stop a scenario from coming to pass is how legal questionable it all appears to be. As a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Harry Lipman has pointed out federal lawsuits require a conflict between two parties. A hurdle of conflict between Mr. and President Trump wouldn't seem to clear. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution bars the government from paying any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States. Would appear to be bar payment to people who attack the Capitol in an effort to overturn the election. The Hyde Amendment of 1997 allows for people who have prevailed against malicious charges by the government to issue and recoup funds, but it can't apply to the insurrectionists who were all rightly convicted, said Jason Manning, a former Justice Department prosecutor who tried January 6 and fraud cases. Hence, the value to Mr. Trump, Mr. Manning said, is a slush fund divorced from law. So maybe this particular scheme will get blocked by the courts. Either way, Mr. Trump's scheming will define him and his family. When he leaves office, the Trump name will most likely be stripped from the Kennedy Center. The challenge coins offered to the White House will no doubt be stripped away. His enhancement to the Oval Office may eventually be remodeled away. All that will be left is his reputation. Mr. Trump has made that synonymous with corruption forever. What do you call someone who taxes you to pay his lackeys? A king. This is written by Jamie Raskin. He's a Democratic representative in Maryland. These days, it takes a spectacular burst of corruption to get the attention of our scandal-worry nation. But President Trump and his administration have managed once again to transfix Americans by establishing $1.776 billion anti-weaponization fund in the Department of Justice that will undoubtedly be used to line the pockets of Mr. Trump's partisans and foot soldiers with your tax dollars. The creation of this fund is a stupefying feat of self-dealing. Part of a settlement agreement between the Department of the Treasury, with Mr. Trump controls, and the plaintiffs, Mr. Trump, two of his sons and their family business, who sued the IRS for $10 billion over the leak of his tax returns, will very likely result in an undeserved windfall to a legion of January 6 rioters who have already unjustly received pardons from Mr. Trump. Every part of this farce is an affront to the Constitution. It usurps both the exclusive power of Congress to legislate programs and spend money and the power of the courts to decide specific cases and controversies. It is, quite simply, a scam. Only Congress has the power to appropriate federal dollars. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution states that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. But Mr. Trump and the acting Attorney General, Tarek Blanche, seem to think they can conjure this joint slush fund into being without congressional approval. Further, Article 3, Section 1 states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Yet the settlement took Mr. Trump's case out of the hands of the courts. It calls foresight for a 5-member board appointed by Blanche and whose members Mr. Trump can dismiss on a whim. Even if this fund were legitimate, that kind of a setup wouldn't be for Mr. Blanche to decide. Congress has never established a court, tribunal, or board to hear pleas from people who believe they are victims of government weaponization, much less a fund almost certainly meant to reward supporters and allies of the president who feel they were wrong simply because they were prosecuted for their actions on January 6, 2021. No matter what you think about the events of January 6, hundreds of rioters indisputably broke the law that day when they stormed the Capitol in an effort to stop the certification of the 2020 presidential election and the peaceful transfer of power. As regrettable as it is, the most of the rioters were pardoned. There's no denying that as president, Mr. Trump has that power, but the same Constitution giving him that power also says that neither the United States or any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in the aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States. January 6 was indeed an insurrection. And pardon or no pardon, no one can legally be compensated for taking part in it. As James Madison wrote in Federalist Number 10, a cardinal principle of our legal system is that no man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest will certainly bias his judgment and not improperly correct his integrity. Here, Mr. Trump's administration settled a case that he thought effectively making him the judge in his own case. He not only concocted the fund, but his Justice Department also threw in a sweetener, shielding him and his sons from audits of any tax returns they have already filed. The $1.776 billion figure is obviously meant to involve the year of our founding. But go back and read the Declaration, in which includes a long list of accusations directed at George III. Among them is a charge that the British king had dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of people. And here's the kicker. The nearly $1.8 billion will come from the Justice Department's Judgment Fund, a fund created by Congress that the administration has already been abusing. The Judgment Fund was set up to allow the federal government to efficiently and promptly pay for final court judgments and proper legal settlements against the United States, process that was once enormous, time-consuming, and burdensome. For 70 years, the Judgment Fund has served its original essential purposes to settling valid, good faith claims. 2 years ago, it paid out almost $140 million to dozens of young women and girls to resolve claims that the FBI failed to protect them from the actions of the serial predator Larry Nassar. But Mr. Trump has threatened this fund as a political piggy bank. His Justice Department agreed to pay nearly $5 million to the family of Zoe Babbitt to settle its wrong death suit against the government. Mr. Babbitt was a January 6 rioter who was fatally shot that day at the Capitol. Her death was certainly a tragedy, but the suit was without merit. Meanwhile, not a single dollar from the fund went to the families of the police officers wounded and injured, or to the families of several who died in the wake of the violence. In March, the department agreed to pay around $1.2 to Michael Flynn, Mr. Trump's disgraced former national security advisor, to settle a case that had been dismissed. In April, the department announced another $1 million settlement, this time to Carter Page, a former advisor of Mr. Trump's 2016. Mr. Page's lawsuit contended that he had been unlawfully surveyed by the FBI during investigation of conflicts between the campaign and Russian government. A federal judge dismissed his lawsuit on statute of limitation grounds. Around 400 January 6 rioters already filed lawsuits under the Federal Claims Act, with most seeking $1 million to $10 million. Another group rioters, including Proud Boys convicted of assaulting, filed a class action demanding over $18 million, claiming that officers who defended the Capitol caused them injuries. And 5 Proud Boys convicted of felonies, including seditious conspiracy, have filed a separate $100 million lawsuit. No one should be surprised if their case wind up being swiftly settled via the president's new MAGA gravy train. But the weaponization fund is a ripoff on an unimaginable larger scale. Last week, I introduced legislation to put a stop to this. It would bar the federal government from paying out money settlements to sitting presidents. It would also prohibit settlement payments for claims involving investigations related to the January 6th or foreign interference in the 2016 presidential election. Members of Congress must act to reassert the exclusive power that the Constitution vests in the legislative branch, or else we make one step further toward making Mr. Trump a king. The conversation, Emily Bazal and David French, the new meaning of the fixes in. Emily Bazelon is a writer in Times Opinion and the Times Magazine who covers legal affairs. I didn't expect to start a conversation with an homage to Jeff Sessions, but the current Trump administration occasions many oddities. I'm thinking about the session because he was Donald Trump's first attorney general. He issued a memo in 2017 barring the Justice Department from settling lawsuits by directing payments to third parties, people or groups who weren't directly harmed by whatever gave rise. The goal was to ensure that settlement funds were only used to compensate victims. Sessions wrote. At the time, Sessions was responding to cases in which the Obama Justice Department negotiated settlement Republicans denounced. One major example was a deal in which banks sued by the government for their lending practices leading up to the 2000 financial crisis settled in part by donating money to groups providing legal aid to people who lost their homes or doing community development in hard-hit neighborhoods. Still, Republicans flagged DOJ for going around Congress to funnel money to groups Democrats liked. The Obama-era practice was not the same as the $1.776 billion fund that Trump Justice Department recently announced. This time, DOJ is going around Congress to pay off Trump's allies in exchange for Trump and his family dropping a dubious $10 billion lawsuit against IRS over the leak of Trump family tax information. Notice the repeating proper noun. To make the self-dealing explicit, Trump also got a grant of immunity from any tax investigation to him and his family, his business, forever. It's all in caps in the document. According to an addendum by the agreement signed by the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. David French, a Times Opinion columnist. You're right. The Obama-era practice is quaint compared with what Trump is buying to do. He's creating a slush fund that, under his total control, will use how he wants, using payment procedures he defines. And the fund is huge. $1.776 billion can make a lot of members of MAGA millionaires. As the settlement agreement says, the so-called anti-weaponization fund shall have the power to determine its own procedures for submitting, receiving, processing, and creating or denying claims. Trump can make it all up. He's doing all this without judicial supervision, with the aim of rewarding people who weren't even parties to his initial case and who have claims that have nothing to do with that case. And let's not forget that Trump is essentially settling with himself. He sued the Internal Revenue Service, which he runs, and the suit was settled by the Department of Justice, which he also runs. This case fails to describe the fix was in, and the fix will be in for all his friends and allies as they grasp for cash. It almost thinks, remember, in the French Revolution, when the people were starving to death and Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. I guess Trump is the modern Marie Antoinette. Emily, Arcash, David, Trump is circumventing Congress' power of the purse. He's circumventing the judiciary role in the adjudicating disputes by potentially granting settlement to people who possess no valid legal claims. He's circumventing civil and criminal law. This is one of the most purely monarchical moments of a monarchical presidency. But it gets worse. As you noted, the addendum to the agreement contains a breathtaking broad release of civil claims against Trump. Think of it as a version of a civil pardon. Presidents have unchecked authority to pardon federal crimes, but they do not have the power to protect themselves from lawsuits. One of the last ways to hold Trump accountable. But now Ted Blanche is trying to do just that, protect Trump from any federal accountability at all. I'm glad you mentioned Sessions. The Obama settlement pales in comparison to the Trump slush fund, but it's still a bad idea. Emily, I mean, really, why did Jeff Sessions bother? Trump forced him out in humiliation. Blanche, he knows better. Defending the deal with testifying last week before his Senate was his route to remaining in power. The January 6 rioters are celebrating. First, Trump gave them a pardon. Now they get taxpayer dollars. Even though if they sue the government on their own behalf, they would surely lose. Trump's decision to pardon January 6 rioters polled poorly, and presumably the slush fund as well. But he doesn't care. David, do you see any political guardrails on the Hill or anywhere else? The defeat of Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and Representative Thomas Macy of Kentucky in Republican primaries last week suggested that Trump's party will be further cowed. With the midterms changes, and what about a legal remedy? Police officers who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are suing to block the slush fund. What do you think of their lawsuit? David. Trump is a profoundly unpopular president who still enjoys the deep devotion of his base. This puts Hill Republicans in a terrible position. As we've just seen in Indiana, Kentucky, and Louisiana, they defy Trump, they lose their jobs. If they obey Trump, they defend the policies and practices that are hurting the country and courting electoral disaster for the GOP. But I have zero sympathy. If they'd done their duty in 2021 and convicted Trump in an impeachment trial, then Trump would be a private citizen. They made their bed and must lie in it, but they made our bed also. We're all paying the price for the decision they made. May history treat their failure with the contempt it deserves. I will note, to give at least a faint glimmer of hope, that Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania Republican has vowed we're going to kill it and is backing legislation to do so. Senator John Thune has expressed his disapproval as well. But when it comes to anything concrete, I believe it when I see it. Before we get to the police lawsuit, I want to affirm your point about an especially terrible aspect of the slush fund. As you said, most citizens have little hope of recovering money from the federal government for violation of their civil rights. So while ordinary Americans suffer, Trump's thugs may get access to millions of dollars in wholly ill-gotten gains. It's a travesty. As for the police lawsuit, I think they have a solid case on the merits. The key questions are whether they have standing to sue and whether the matter is ripe for justification. It's too early for me to tell. An editorial comment: regardless of your political beliefs, that's irrelevant. But when you read this about the corruption, that's not irrelevant. You know, we're always talking about Tammany Hall and how maybe President Kennedy's father was able to get him president, etc., etc. But this is beyond the pale. I mean, There's no way to describe your disgust for what's going on. Cubans deserve a new story. The theft of a Castro prosecution in the U.S. opens a window into a larger problem. This is written by Michael Busanis, the author of Cuban Memory Wars. 30 years after Cuban MiG-29 fighter jet shot down two Cessnas operated by the Miami-based humanitarian group Brothers to the Rescue, killing 4 people, including 3 U.S. citizens, flying in international airspace over the Florida Straits. U.S. federal prosecutors have issued an indictment against Raul Castro for his alleged role in authorizing the attack. For the families of the dead, the announcement brings a measure of justice. Regardless of whether Mr. Castro, 94, who was defense minister at the time and later was head of the state, ever sees a day in court. It is impossible, though, to separate the move from Trump administration's escalating pressure campaigns against Havana over the past several months. Since January, the United States has imposed a de facto oil blockade in Cuba with punishing humanitarian consequences, threatening sweeping new sanctions on foreign companies doing business with the island, and issued a direct ultimatum to communal officials to reform their political and economic system, or else, if the Trump administration lacked a pretext for pushing its confrontation with Havana towards military action, the indictment may clear the way. But the threat of a Castro prosecution in the United States opens a window into a larger problem that Cubans will confront in any future transition from the revolutionary government established in 1959, especially if political change arrives through Washington's intervention. How should Cubans react with the many injustices accumulated over nearly 7 decades of revolution, exile, and yes, geopolitical conflict with their northern neighbors? How can they reconcile competing attitudes in Cuban communities toward the role of the U.S. in their national identity and life? Can the country afford to reopen the past if it hopes to move forward? Can it afford not to? The choreography around Wednesday's indictment highlights the stakes. The announcement of the indictment on May 20, Cuba's original Independence Day, was calculated to conjure larger battles over Cubans' collective memory. The date in 1902 marked the end of 4 years of U.S. military occupation after the U.S. intervened in the midst of Cuba's final war for independence against Spain. Washington thereafter imposed strict limitations on the island's sovereignty as a condition for allowing Cubans to govern themselves. For the Trump administration, the date neatly resonates with its renewed hemispheric dominance. For many Cuban Americans, it still represents the birth of a republic they romanticize as a kind of paradise lost in the revolution. But Fidel Castro's government stopped celebrating the holiday after 1959, seeing it as a symbol of incomplete liberation. While his first goal was to end the authoritarian rule of dictator Fulgencio Batista in the 1950s, Fidel Castro and other activists also portrayed the revolution as the delayed realization of the island's original independence struggle, promising to deliver Cubans from the dependers on the United States that has haunted the Cuban Republic since its birth. Revolutions, though, are not simply the culmination of history. They create histories of their own. Cuba's transformation to a one-party communist state in the early 60s generated two layers of trauma and injustice: political imprisonment, labor camps, counterinsurgency campaigns, property confiscations, exile, surveillance, and censorship. Over the following 30 years, Cuba became as tethered to Soviet subsidies and trade as it had once been to the United States. With support collapse, economic precarity, and stubborn resistance to liberating helped to serve the ways of migration and further Cuban families. Any future political transition will require something more difficult than high-profile prosecutions or rewriting of school texts to suit the narrative of the victor. Cubans will have to find a way to acknowledge the harms they have endured and indict it on one another while making the nation permanently captive to them. The United States, too, should be willing to recount for its own role in Cuba's long and tortured trajectory. Cubans and Cuban Americans deserve more than the endless historical war or symbolic indictments in the U.S. court. They deserve the possibility of a new national story. And that is all they own. Three decades in the Supreme Court. How to solve a problem like the tenure of Clarence Thomas. Term limits. As of May 7th, Justice Clarence Thomas is the second longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history. When he took his judicial oath in October 1991, nearly half Americans alive today were not yet born. Text was a noun and not a verb. Justice Thomas now trails only William O. Douglas, who served 36 years before stepping down in 1975, although much of his last year was overshadowed by a stroke that left him partly paralyzed and paranoid. Justice Thomas is far alone in his durability. Justice John Paul Stevens served nearly 35 years before he stepped down in 2010. In the past half-century, Justice Brennan, Black, Rehnquist, Kennedy all joined the three-decade club. The average justice tenure is now more than 28 years, by far the longest among modern democracies. Whatever your politics, we should be able to agree that in representative democracy, no one should hold so much power for so long. Why aren't term limits in place already? Because until recently, there was no clear need for them. Throughout most of American history, the average justice served for about 15 years. Constitution framers gave justice lifetime tenure in order to insulate them from day-to-day politics. But the average life expectancy in 1787 was about half what it is today, and the framers almost certainly did not envision a single justice sitting for as many as 10 presidential administrations, a near monarchical stretch of time. The only way to force one from the bench is through impeachment in the House, followed by conviction by 2/3 of the Senate, which has never happened. Hence, the appeal of term limits, which can be imposed through federal law, despite the claims of some legal scholars and no doubt the feelings of the Supreme Court justice. Multiple term limit bills have been introduced in Congress over the past few years, all of which contain the same basic features. 18-year terms for justices, with regularized appointment every 2 years. On a 9-justice court, each president would get 2 appointments per 4-year terms. After the term, justice would transition to senior status, a system similar to the one currently used in federal courts, including for Supreme Court justices who retire from service. A senior justice could sit temporarily in the lower federal court and could fill in the Supreme Court if an active justice is recused or unable to hear a case. Such a law would have multiple benefits. First, it would return justice terms roughly to the length that they averaged until the 1970s. Secondly, it would establish a more democratic, faithful system in which the court's membership better reflects the nation's electoral choices. The predictability of appointments could also reduce the heat of confirmation hearings, which have turned into partisan circuses full of grandstanding by lawmakers and obfuscation, if not outright dishonesty by nominees. Third, it would bring America High Court into line with every other democracy in the 49 states that impose term limits. Age limits are both their high court judgment. Rhode Island is the exception. To understand how meaningful these changes would be in practice, we can look again to Justice Thomas. For starters, they would eliminate multi-generational tenures like his. In 2 more years, Justice Thomas would be the longest-serving justice ever, yet he is still relatively youthful in Supreme Court terms, more than a decade younger than Justice Stevens was when he stepped down. Health permitting, Justice Thomas could serve on the court for half a century. Republicans, if not Democrats, have learned from his example, tapping every younger nominees to lock in an ideological sympathizer, far from the future. Like tenure, in other words, incentivize partisan gamesmanship at the expense of democratic legitimacy. Meanwhile, regularly third appointments would ensure that actual quirks did not define the court for decades. Justice Thomas got a seat after his predecessor, John Thurgood Marshall, retired because of failing health, giving George Bush a vacancy to fill. As it turned out, Marshall died on January 24th, 4 days after Bill Clinton entered the White House. Had Marshall held a seat at the end many justices have, Clinton would have filled the vacancy, not with Justice Thomas, but with someone far more in line with Marshall's robust commitment to civil rights and racial equality. Or consider what happened in 2020 when Justice Ruth Ginsburg died weeks before Election Day. In a matter of days, Senator Mitch McConnell and his Republican colleagues rushed through the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to complete a 6-3 right-wing supermajority, even though 4 years earlier, the Republicans had blocked President Barack Obama from filling a vacancy for 9 months on the grounds that the election was too close. Millions of Americans already cast their ballots by the time Justice Barrett was sworn in. To prevent this sort of bad faith, norm-shattering behavior, any timeline would need to gain a fast-track mechanism to ensure a timely up or down Senate vote on examiners. Of all the smart Supreme Court reforms under debate, term limits are one of the most popular across the political spectrum, with multiple polls averaging 73%. Leading Republicans, including Senators Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, as well as Marco Rubio, when he was a senator, have expressed support for term limits. There are many choices about how to carry out such a reform, including whether to exempt current judges. That would be a tough pill to swallow, given the countless ethical standards of Justice Thomas and Samuel Alito, for starters. But changing the Supreme Court is a long game, and a forward-looking bill as the price of passage through Congress is worth considering. Of course, a prospective law would also expand the court temporarily as new members were added. The court returned to 9 when the list of current justices retired. What about the claim that term limits may be adopted only by constitutional amendment, as my colleague at the Brennan Center for Justice have explained, and as dozens of leading legal scholars and retired judges? That's not true. Congress has the clear authority to pass such a law as part of its unquestionable power to alter the size, jurisdiction, and other key elements of the court. The court itself, in the 1934 case that Congress may lighten judicial duties, and that the federal judge do not lose their office for their salary by assuming senior status. Might justice be tempted to take financial advantage of a post-judicial life, thus calling into question the integrity of the votes and opinions in the court? It's possible, but life tenure is no guarantee against the dangers of corruption. As illustrated by the close personal relationship Thomas and Alito have developed with wealthy GOP donors, for some with businesses before the court, the knowledge that justice are installed for life makes it, if anything, more appealing to apply them with favors and seek to win their allegiance for decades to come. Term limits are just one fix, but they are an essential one, and they will require a Congress and President committed to helping the Supreme Court regain the trust and respect of the American people. AI won't create unemployment. The nation has historically created jobs in response to disruption. This is written by David Solomon as chairman and chief executive of Goldman Sachs. In conversation with hundreds of business leaders over the past few months, I have seen a sharp divide on their views of artificial intelligence. One camp sees a job apocalypse and mass unemployment ahead. The other sees a great leap forward for society. Put me in the second camp, with a few caveats. Will AI disrupt the labor market? Absolutely. This transition, like other moments in history, will entail new challenges, especially as AI separates labor from productivity in magnitude not seen before. But the United States has a long track record of creating new jobs in response to disruption, from the electrification of the 1900s to the digital revolution of the 90s. I don't see any reason to think this dynamic will stop now. There's no question AI will reshape our everyday lives. Goldman Sachs economists estimate that over the next decade, AI may automate 25% of current work hours. While it's difficult to see how people in hands-on professions like food preparation, construction, or service will be affected, people in white-collar jobs, among them accountants, bankers, lawyers, will likely see many of their tasks automated. According to one Stanford study, in the occupation most susceptible to great automation, such as software engineering or customer service, entry-level employment has already declined by 16% to the least exposed rules. Another editorial comment, I'm a retired banker, and I've been retired for 30 years. And when I was at the bank and when you wanted to cash a check, you had to look at microfiche to find out if there were adequate funds. And now we're used to see lines at a bank to cash checks. You may see 5 or 6 tellers. You see one teller and maybe 3 people in line. So the article is very poignant. But when you look at jobs or sectors less relevant to automation, the picture changes. Our economists estimate that the growing demand for data centers has created more than 200,000 construction jobs since 2022. While AI eliminates jobs in some sectors, it may lead to job growth in others. Goldman Sachs may need fewer people in regulatory reporting or client outboarding, freeing us to hire more bankers, traders, asset managers who are interacting with clients constantly. Of course, we can't dismiss the human cost of such disruption. The Industrial Revolution raised living standards only after society endured the hardships of grueling labor in mills and mines and the fetid slums that came with rapid urbanization. In recent decades, manufacturing employment has declined significantly owing to automation and global outsourcing. This caused enormous hardships for many families and communities across America. But for all those challenges, I keep bumping against this reality. Standards of living for a vast majority of Americans are significantly higher than they used to be. When I was born in 1962, the average American adult did not have air conditioning, but as air conditioning prices dropped, nearly all of us got cooler. In the 90s, only a few large corporations like IBM had computers. Now, some 90% of American adults walk around with a supercomputer in their hand. In 1900, global life expectancy at birth was 32 years. Today, it's over 70. Perhaps more to the point, job growth has outpaced population growth. Since 1962, civilian employment in the U.S. has increased by roughly 145%, while civilian population age 16 has risen by about 128%. In that time, we've seen new sectors emerge as others have grown or faded. While manufacturing employment declined from 15 million to 12 million over the period, led by almost 2 million jobs lost in textile and apparel making, the healthcare industry now employs more than 18 million workers. The U.S. economy is still the most innovative, dynamic, and entrepreneurial in the world. It's true that even the most reliable historical patterns can be broken, but there are 3 reasons I expect the U.S. economy to remain as resilient and dynamic as ever. First, if our estimate proves correct, AI will eliminate 25% of the jobs. What's more likely is that people will find more productive ways to spend their time. When I was a first-year banking analyst, something as simple as making a graph of stocks performance took 6 hours of looking up prices in back issue of the Wall Street Journal on microfiche. Today, a first-year analyst can do in seconds, and we have employed more people than ever in recent years with more sophisticated tools. The complexity of our work naturally expands. Do any of us feel like we have less to do these days, despite the convenience of Excel, email, or Zoom? Second, just because the job can be replaced doesn't mean it will be. The TV didn't eliminate the demands for live entertainment, nor did the internet put real estate agents or fitness instructors out of business. Instead, these technologies highlighted and enhanced the value of those professions. Technological changes have culture change do not move in tandem. After all, even after decades of ATM digital banking and bank consolidation, employment in commercial banking is at roughly the same level as it was in the mid-1990s. Third, the American labor market is vibrant. While net job creation is a few million per year at most, the gross number is much higher. American companies destroy and create 25 million to 35 million jobs annually. It's easy to imagine the pace will ramp up as AI enables even more innovation, and we're already seeing the economy adapt. Companies are now looking for people to manage so-called agentic AI and incorporate it into a wide variety of areas, from implementation and workflows to compliance and validation. All of this requires human judgment. If AI does indeed destroy jobs at a potential greater speed than we've seen, then public policy must respond by funding large-scale reskilling or encouraging AI that supports workers instead of replacing them. This must be a joint effort between the public and private sectors. The public sector should create incentives and provide resources where necessary, including investing more in vocational schools, community college. The private sector should help workers upgrade their skills and reimagine on-the-job training. The historical pattern is clear. The U.S. economy can and will adapt to major advances in technology. What's also clear is that stark forecasts by even the most brilliant minds often miss their mark. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes famously predicted that by 2030, people would work only 15 hours a week, while his vision of a leisure-filled future remains unfulfilled. It is a good reminder that fears of a job apocalypse may very well overlook AI's potential to support an economic and productivity revival. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, May 24th issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability,